Hey guys, welcome back. So continuing our talks about Absolute Carnage, there's a lot of significant points that ease their way into here that I wanted to shed a little bit of light on, with its ties to Carnage USA, Cult of Carnage, Agents of Wakanda, Immortal Hulk, just to name a few. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so prior to this point on the Absolute Carnage playlist, we've talked about Carnage Born, where we covered how he came back from Venomized and how we've been given the layout for this build up for him returning with new purpose, of collecting the codex from every person who has ever wore a symbiote. And for Carnage, in most cases we've seen that this really just means ripping their spine out, which is not okay because that's not really something people can do without. But so when Absolute Carnage begins, it really kicks off towards the conclusion of the War of Realms, with him coming after Eddie Brock just after all that madness had taken place. And we're still covering War of Realms, so what I'm thinking I'll do is just add a video on there just saying what Carnage was doing during the War of Realms and just tag that onto both playlists, and that way you guys have a better idea of what exactly he was doing during that time. But for now, picking up from where we left off, when Carnage had came after both Eddie and his son Dylan, they were not at all ready for this confrontation, which one led them to flee, but it also led the Venom symbiote to take both Eddie and his son Dylan to Peter Parker. And this shows us a few things here, because one, you have Peter Parker who's through with this whole symbiote mess because he's been through it so many times, which also makes me think of Symbiote Spider-Man, which has like this Eddie Brock teaser, which also has me pretty anxious to see how they're going to retell the story of them two meeting. But at this point in Absolute Carnage, they've known each other for years, and their friendship, if you want to call it that, which has formed over the years, it's reached a place of Peter Parker understanding more or less that Eddie's trying to do better. But with them having not spoken for a while and Eddie just showing up with his kid, it begs the question, like, who is this? Like, I get the idea that you're trying to do better, Eddie, but the whole mentor program, I don't think it's for you, not yet. But another thing that's kind of boiling under the surface here is that Eddie, he doesn't necessarily want to be here. Like, it wasn't his choice to come to Peter Parker. Like, the Venom symbiote just brought him here and boom, here we are. And while Peter's trying to probe and figure out what's going on and get caught up, the Venom symbiote tells Eddie to see this through and not let his jealousy get the best of him. And I'll admit, Peter Parker and the symbiote were kind of a perfect pair, and much at Peter's expense. But one of the things that Eddie really has to realize at this point, and what I feel like he's been discovering more so recently, is that him and the symbiote have much more in common as far as history, family, and personal flaws than Eddie's really acknowledging. But eventually Eddie tells Dylan to give them a moment so they can get into some grown people talk, and it's here where Eddie tells Peter that Dylan's his son, but no, Dylan doesn't know. And this causes Peter to really urge Eddie to tell Dylan because he personally knows how rough it is to grow up without a father. But in the middle of this conversation, Eddie's attention is drawn towards the breaking news, which gives the revelation of this massive graveyard in northern New Jersey, with them discovering the bodies of Angelo Fortunato, as well as deceased members of the Life Foundation, even though the company is no longer officially active. But also, and probably most notably, amongst these bodies, many of which are still not identified, they also found the body of General Ross. And so real quick, just to talk about the most significant two that were shown here, and first starting with Angelo, who had been Venom for a short while. And this came about back when your Marvel Knights issues were being published. And because Marvel Knights was darker and a bit more grittier, like the narrative got a bit crazy. But at this time with Eddie Brock, who was trying to turn a new leaf, and he had decided that he was going to auction off the Venom symbiote because hey, he wanted to be a better person, so this thing that was making him worse, he figured, hey, I'm just going to sell it to somebody else. And that way he could sleep at night knowing he did something good that day. And so as it turned out, the symbiote had been sold to crime boss Don Fortunato, who had then given the symbiote to his son because Spider-Man issues are full of great parents. But what happened was Don passed this down to his son with the intention of making a man out of him, because prior to this he had believed his son to be too cowardly. But as a result, he attacked Peter Parker at the school he was teaching at, to where he started killing staff members and an old classmate of Peter Parker, and at one point where he had thought that he had killed Spider-Man by ripping his heart out, but as it turned out, it wasn't actually Spider-Man, but rather just a guy dressed up as Spider-Man trying to make money from taking pictures. But this eventually led to the Venom symbiote leaving Angelo after facing the real Spider-Man on a rooftop, who had beaten the brakes off of this Angelo Venom so bad that he decided to run away. And one, this is mainly because Peter Parker turned it up because this dude just killed a guy. But for the Venom symbiote at the time, who had seen Angelo as weak and making so many crass decisions off of fear, when Angelo leaped off the building to get away, halfway through the jump, the Venom symbiote was like, yeah, you know what, I'm gonna finish this jump by myself and I'm gonna let you and Gravity work out the rest. which pretty much left Angelo up Poops Creek without a paddle. But as far as General Ross, who we've talked about in the Immortal Hulk playlist, this is one of those things that's also been addressed within the Immortal Hulk series, being dead, then not being dead, then being dead again. And if you guys remember, like on that playlist when we talked about the recent funeral of General Ross, this is one of those things that had Tony Stark kind of stirred up because he wasn't necessarily sure if Ross was just gonna hop back out of that coffin again. And like we talked about with everything dealing with the Immortal Hulk and the immortality factor of everyone who's been a Hulk, with General Ross, this creates a whole nother scenario with him being a Hulk and also formerly having a symbiote in a quite unique situation on both ends, which for me builds up this exciting anticipation for what could be around the corner, not only in Absolute Carnage but also in the Immortal Hulk. But with this breaking news being a bit graphic for like your public audiences, the bartender shuts it off and Eddie's like, no, this is about Carnage, we have to do something about it. And then immediately the dumbest criminals in the world try to rob the place with Spider-Man standing inside in full costume. Like, had they just looked in the window, they could have avoided all of this. But then again, if they were smarter, they wouldn't be committing armed robbery in the first place. But so with Spider-Man taking these guys out in like 2 seconds, and with talking to Eddie getting caught up on pretty much everything that's going on, he tells Eddie that they need to find somebody like Reed Richards who can extract the codices from all these people who Carnage is after, as a plan to at least move what Carnage wants and not make all these people living targets. And this brings us to the safe house of Rex Strickland, to where we find the Maker, who's here after receiving a call from Eddie Brock, to where at this point he's already constructed a device that will extract the codices from any individual who's ever worn a symbiote. And it's not necessarily like Eddie just called the Maker and he just made this super quick, even though his name is the Maker and he makes stuff, but this device in particular is something that he had been working on for quite some time. And this is something that leads more into what he's been working on with Project Oversight and the projects that began after Eddie and Miles fought the Grendel symbiote, which at this point is being worn by Carnage. But because of all this codec extracting device, it's been something that the Maker had seen need for quite some time. But with Carnage going ham recently, he noticed he had to speed up the process. But shortly after, when Spider-Man arrives, to where this is his first time meeting the Maker. And it's pretty crazy to think about that, since we've been talking about the Maker nearly since the beginning of this channel, with our talks about James Hudson Jr., the son of Wolverine, and his lifetime journey from the 1610 universe to the 616, which makes it pretty crazy to think about because so much has happened since then and these two are just meeting. Not to mention that it just blows Peter Parker's mind that he's standing in front of an alternate reality version of Reed Richards. But it's funny when Spider-Man comes here because the Maker's like, oh, you brought a kid too. But as it turns out, the kid that Spider-Man had brought with him is actually his godson, Normie Osborn. And so now this is the part where we talk about something we haven't talked about, because still within Marvel Legacy, but back in Spider-Man issue number 794, where we got your threat level red, this is what ended up giving us Norman Osborn as the Red Goblin, which was a crazy combination with him dealing both with the Goblin Serum, to which Spider-Man had tried to cure him of at one point, and then after stealing the Carnage symbiote, like, he completely lost his mind from there. But leading into your Red Goblin event, we had eventually seen that Norman Osborn, one of his plans was to track down his grandson Normie, and also bond him with a part of the Carnage symbiote, which wasn't that far-fetched of an idea for Dan Slott to throw in, but it added a compelling twist to a character we haven't seen in a while. And fast forward to now, where we get to Absolute Carnage, where everyone who has had a symbiote ever is on this list, to where he needs to be protected as well. And this brings him to the point to where the Maker, who's going to use this device to extract the codex from Normie, but he tells them that he needs a sample of blood before they get started. But Spider-Man, he heavily objects, mainly because he doesn't want his godson to be the first guinea pig on this machine, and understandably so, because granted that this is another Reed Richards, but even still they don't want to take the risk, they need to be sure. But when the Maker's like, do you have any other suggestions of somebody else, Eddie and Peter kind of just look at each other in a very we're about to get morally sketchy type of way, which then leads them to Ravencroft, which is the asylum where Norman Osborn is currently being held. But after everything that had taken place with the Red Goblin event, Norman began to change to the point of where he believes that he's actually Cletus Kasady, which could possibly in retrospect be something that Cletus Kasady has done to him, being that Norman bonded with Kasady's symbiote prior to this point, which eventually caused him to go crazy. And I wouldn't be surprised if that insanity had been a plan of Kasady all along. But so when Peter and Eddie arrive here, they actually made their way in through a connection that Peter used through Jonathan Jameson III, who we had talked about not long ago, with his whereabouts mainly being connected with Agents of Wakanda. which is where he landed after the War of the Realms. But also in our talks about the Cult of Carnage, it was then that we found out, prior to the War of Realms, or more so prior to the conclusion, because War of Realms is literally like hundreds of years building up in the making. But we had talked about in my Cult of Carnage video how not long after Carnage USA, Jameson had ran into Carnage while checking out the weird happenings that were going on in Doverton, and it was there in Doverton where he discovered the cult, and even with him trying to resist and wolf out, he still ended up getting infected with a symbiote. And from that time all the way up till now, he's kind of been Carnage's sleeper agent, with a part of Carnage that has been hiding under his subconscious this whole time. But when Jonathan takes the two of them over to Norman's holding cell, everything goes berserk at this point, because Spider-Man's spider sense is going off. Jonathan starts chanting "God is coming" with Kasady's voice, so it's like they don't know if he's gonna wolf out or he's gonna go Carnage mode or what. But when he expresses that he's compelled to get Norman out of there, and he shoots the door, and this causes the alarm to go off, which makes Venom go crazy, it's here that we find out that this is all being set off by the arrival of Cletus Kasady. And when he gets there, he's just throwing these little worm-like pieces that he's been using to build his army, but when he arrives in this asylum, he starts throwing them to the random inmates. But it's here where we see him do this in Absolute Venom. It's a lot different to what we had seen back in Web of Venom, because back at the time, soon after Kasady had been reborn, he would use this exact same method once again to build his army, but at the time, the products of him doing this, they're more so of a zombie-like result. But fast forward to now in Absolute Carnage, after Kasady has already sent the message of how many codices he's collected, we come to find out that not only is he stronger, but his army is stronger as well, which is crazy because with him collecting these codices, it's like his abilities are being amplified on every front, as if this version of Carnage wasn't the worst one yet, but it's like now he's able to create armies who appear to be very similar to those that we've seen in recent issues of Venom, who are more direct descendants of Knull. But when everything goes crazy here, Spider-Man is just like, dude, where is the Sentry when you need him? Because we need somebody to just fly all this into space and just tear it to shreds real quick. And of course, the Sentry does not come busting through the wall like, "Here I come to save the day." Did somebody say Sentry? Like, that just would have been way too soon. Like, too soon, too easy. And as a result, at this point in time, like, there's nobody like stopping Carnage, because at this point he is a literal juggernaut, and if he wants something, he's going to get it. And when he just throws Spider-Man into the cell of Norman Osborn, who at this point is even looking like Cletus Kasady, and mainly because at this point, as far as he's concerned, he really thinks he is. But with Venom and Spider-Man getting here and attempting to take Norman back to the Maker, but only getting here moments before the arrival of Cletus Kasady, it's really just one of those situations of too little too late. Because at this point, when Kasady finally gets his hands on Osborn, who Eddie and Peter thought that he came here to kill, but instead of killing him, Kasady gives him a Carnage symbiote that surprisingly does not have the symbol on the forehead, likely meaning that Kasady is allowing Osborn to think on his own to an extent, and likely still believing that he's Cletus Kasady. But we'll have to see, because that could be a crazy setup, whether he's doing it to collect more codices in the future, or if he's using it to set up Knull later on down the road. But that'll do it for this one, guys. I'll just leave it right there. Leave your thoughts, your theories, all of that down in the comments below, because man, like, Absolute Carnage is just absolutely wonderful. But let me know what you guys think, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.